This is going to be my quick tutorial on how I made this puff quilt. For a quilt of this size, I recommend picking out 12 to 14 different kinds of fabric and getting a half yard of each. You are going to cut all your fabrics into 5.5-inch squares and your backing fabric, which can be any fabric, into 5-inch squares. For every square, you're going to be sewing 3 sides to the back fabric to create what I like to call a little pocket. For these pockets, you're going to want the opening to be at the bottom. So if you have a fabric that has a specific orientation, make sure you line it up so that you start where the opening will be on the bottom. To create these pockets, you are going to fold the top fabric to create a pleat, and that's how you get the squares to line up. Next is the fun part where you get to plan out your design. Once you have your design planned out, you're going to stack and label each of your rows. For this quilt, there are 12 by 14 squares. Next, we are going to sew each of the row pockets together. I recommend starting with the top row. I like to knock out doing several rows at once because it does help save me on thread and time. Starting with the top row, you're going to fill each of your pockets with polyfill and then sew that row closed. Then you'll attach the second row to the row you just sewed. When I made my first puff quilt, one thing I really struggled with was to make sure that all my squares lined up perfectly. The method that worked for me to get my squares to line up is using clips and making my seams go opposite direction. So I will have them go opposite direction, then use my fingers to feel where they have lined up and then clip. I always do this step before I attach a new row to what I had sewn previously. This is what it will look like after you have attached all your rows and filled them with polyfill. If you would like to add a trim like I did, you want to make sure your trim is facing towards the center of your quilt and then sew along the edge. The last step is to attach your backing fabric. Lay your backing fabric down on the ground with the pattern facing upwards. Then you are going to place your puff quilt with the pattern facing down. You will then pin your backing fabric to your puff quilt. Make sure you stretch each of your puff quilt squares as you do this step. Then you'll cut off the excess backing fabric and start sewing. You will sew the entirety of 3 of the sides, and then the 4th side you will leave a hole. This hole is so that you can flip your puff quilt the right side out. And the last step is to hand sew the hole closed. I use a ladder stitch to do this. And this is what your puff quilt will look like in the end. I do prefer this method for my puff quilts rather than some of the easy methods I have seen, just because I prefer the look of how this one turns out.